So when I first started training Chinese martial arts, I believed all the fantastical stories about the Shaolin Temple, all the incredible stuff that happened. Now that I'm a human adult, I'd like to know what actually happened though. So today, we're reading a book. Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. My name's Matt. If you're new here, this is a channel about Chinese martial arts. Bam! Today, we're reading books. It's The Shaolin Monastery by Meir Shahar. It's a great book, really interesting. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. So this book is a great read, takes a really wide sweeping view of the Shaolin Temple, putting it into historical context, has some actual references, cites its sources. That's a good start. So Shaolin isn't the birthplace of all of Chinese Kung Fu, but it does have an interesting part of the story, and as the legend around Shaolin grows, I guess that part of the story becomes even more important. So something that's also worth remembering as us as Chinese martial artists, as we often think of Shaolin as a place of martial arts, but its primary focus was a religious site. It did have monks that did some sort of martial arts, as we'll cover in a minute, but it wasn't like you walk in the front door, you've got all these Shaolin monks doing WWE style moves on each other. It was a religious monastery at the end of the day. Now, through reading this book, there's 4 key takeaways. The first one, which I found really interesting, is the idea of Bodhidharma, Dharma as the brand. Bodhidharma is the monk who came from India, supposedly went to Shaolin, as the legend goes. He became the first patriarch of Chan Buddhism. The legend also changed throughout history, which is covered very well in the book. So for various reasons, Bodhidharma was associated with Shaolin. Now we can't even prove he necessarily went there, but the legend changed around him. He was linked to Shaolin. And the Shaolin promotion of Bodhidharma also promotes the Shaolin brand. Shaolin and Chan Buddhism was only one of many different types of Buddhism. And so promotion of Dharma helps to promote Shaolin and Chan as well. And so that's worth keeping in mind when we think about the legend of Shaolin and as to how it gained notoriety. And so the promotion of Bodhidharma, which then helped promote Shaolin, gave Shaolin, I guess maybe a bit more of a better brand over some other Buddhist sites, some of which were destroyed rather than Shaolin at some point in history. Now, something else I took away from this book, you kind of know it probably from some of the stories, but Shaolin essentially had an army. You can call it whatever name you want to call it, but the fighting monks were called upon by the emperor and fought pirates and bandits. It sounds like some sort of kung fu movie, but it actually happened. There were times when Buddhism in China was suppressed, so notably the Tang dynasty, because the Shaolin were carrying out some tasks for the government, be it fighting the old pirates or whatever, they were given a bit more favour and not burnt down like some of the other temples. Now, whilst we're talking about this army, you might conjure up in your mind from having watched some martial arts movies that all these monks, all these Shaolin monks turn up in their grey or orange robes, go at it hand-to-hand style with the pirates and the bandits. But when we talk about martial arts back in the day, certainly before the Ming dynasty, we're talking about people with weapons, so monks with swords and spears and all the rest of it, but they were also notably known for Shaolin staff fighting. And so Shaolin was known for centuries for its stick fighting, well before any of the open hand stuff came up. It was only around the sort of 16th to 17th century, around the Ming dynasty, when open hand fighting was more and more of a thing in China generally, that the Shaolin started to do some of their own. It wasn't necessarily created in Shaolin, like the legend goes that it was brought from India and developed there and spread throughout China. Now, it was probably because that region of China had lots of different styles, and apparently in the historical record there's lots of different styles of people who were using Chinese martial arts, developing open hand styles. Chen village isn't far away where Chen Tai Chi came from, and so that was all happening in the same sort of hotbed. And so it was only later on that the idea of open hand Shaolin patterns came about, which is contrary to the stories that we often hear about Shaolin and, you know, this Kung Fu yoga that came from India. It's given from the things I've just said, but Bodhidharma never taught Kung Fu to the monks. And in fact, he wasn't even linked to the Shaolin Kung Fu at all until much, much later on in the history of the temple. So up until the 17th century, Bodhidharma wasn't linked to Shaolin martial arts. He was linked to the religious side of things, to the Chan Buddhism. He was named the first patriarch of Chan, but he wasn't the guy that brought Kung Fu to China. So around the 17th century though, as open hand fighting became more of a thing in China, and so the styles that we know of modern, I say modern Kung Fu, the traditional styles in Kung Fu are from that era, 17th century and either side, I guess. Around that time, we start to get this legend of Bodhidharma being the origin of Shaolin Kung Fu. And that didn't come from Shaolin, funnily enough. Okay, so come with me on a quick journey. What we call these days Qigong comes from ancient, millennia-old practices in Taoism linked to the idea of Taoyin, of exercising your body, of Qi in the body and all that kind of stuff. Now all of the idea behind Taoyin, that's all native to China, it's indigenous, so it's not an influence from Buddhism. However, Buddhism later influenced some of that Taoist practice, so notably in meditation. And so there were Taoist, meditative and other practices that had this influence from Buddhism. And because of that, they had named Bodhidharma as part of their routines or part of their exercises. And so he then becomes part of the stories that the Taoists say. So they attribute Bodhidharma with the creation of many other exercises, but around the 17th century, someone gets a bit confused, and the legend goes that he also took the Shaolin martial arts to Shaolin, so these open hand routines. Before that, the monks talked about one of the other Buddhist deities who happens to have a staff. They talk about him being the origin of the Shaolin staff fighting technique, and Shaolin is known for centuries for its staff fighting technique. At some point, the Taoists start spreading this rumor that the open hand stuff came from Bodhidharma, and that starts to become part of the story in Shaolin, that actually Bodhidharma created the Shaolin fighting arts, the open-handed fighting arts, which until that point people weren't saying. And the fourth thing I took away from the book is that the Shaolin open hand fighting wasn't just for fighting. So certainly my impression from reading some other sources is that Chinese martial arts were originally a lot more about fighting, and perhaps that is less of the case now. But in fact, as early as the 17th century, there's this whole bit between the Ming and the Qing period where the breathing exercises, these Taoyin exercises, are incorporated into Chinese martial arts. And so back in the 17th century, Shaolin monks were doing the forms, and it wasn't just about fighting, it also had this Taoyin, this breathing stuff about it, and sort of, I guess, a bit of philosophy in there as well. And that's really early on in the practice of Shaolin Kung Fu, the open-handed Shaolin Kung Fu. So at Shaolin is accepted really on the usefulness of forms beyond just their fighting application. The forms were practiced as a type of exercise incorporating the fighting movements, not just as a fighting practice, which I guess is what we do today. But that's the beauty of history. You realise that humans are always just the same and always have been. There's so much more in the book, and it's really a wide-ranging book. Another book on Shaolin is American Shaolin by Matthew Polly. If you're interested, check out that video. Hope you enjoy this one. I'll see you in the next one.